I was not supposed to be the reason Bastian Vandermeer broke his own rule in front of the entire town. He'd set the rule himself the first night, lying in the dark of his cabin above the boathouse with his hands still damp from hauling in lines. Nobody finds out. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. He said it like a man laying down a buoy line, not cruel, just careful, the way you mark a channel so nobody runs aground on the rocks you already know are there. I said okay, I meant it. For 3 months in Gills Rock, Wisconsin, at the very tip of the Door County Peninsula, where the strait between the mainland and Washington Island has been swallowing boats since the 1800s, and the locals still call it Death's Door without irony, I was a careful secret. I'd come up from Madison in June with a contract from a regional outdoors magazine, 4 months to photograph the peninsulas, lighthouses, its monarch migration through the orchards, its loons on the inland lakes, and, if I was lucky, the wrecks visible just under the surface of the strait on a calm day. I rented a cottage behind a cherry orchard. I met Bastian in July on the dock when he was coiling a rescue line after a training drill, and I was trying to get a shot of the evening light without getting in his way. "You're going to want a longer lens for that gull," he said, not looking up from the rope. "He won't come closer than 40 feet. He's been burned by tourists with bread." That was the whole conversation. I went home and could not stop thinking about his hands on the rope. By August, I knew what his hands felt like on other things. I also knew why he'd asked for secrecy, and it wasn't shame. Not exactly. It was arithmetic. Bastian was 31 and had been captain of the volunteer fire department's water rescue and dive team for 6 years. In a town of 400 people, where everyone on that team had known him since he was a boy, bringing his grandfather's nets in off the Anna Merritt. His grandfather, Peter Arter Vandermeer, had emigrated from Wallonia as a teenager to the Belgian settlement around Brussels, Wisconsin, 40 minutes south, and had raised Bastian's father on the water, and had raised Bastian the same way after his father's boat went down in a November squall when Bastian was 9. Peter was 81 now, devout, proud, the last of his generation in the harbor, and Bastian had never once heard him speak kindly about men like us. Bastian wasn't hiding from the town. He was hiding from the old man who taught him to swim. I understood it. I hated it. I stayed anyway. The rule held for 3 months, mostly. We were careful in public. A nod at the bait shop, nothing more. The careful choreography of 2 men who'd agreed not to be the town's new story. In private, in the cabin above the boathouse, with the gulls loud on the roof and the orchards turning gold outside the one small window, he was a different person, slower, unguarded. He'd trace the line of my jaw like he was checking a knot for strength. Tenderness was just another kind of competence to him. Something you did correctly or not at all. "You okay?" He asked me once, after a long silence. He was checking equipment. "I keep being," I said. "Me too," he said, and pressed his mouth to my forehead like he was sealing something shut. I photographed the lighthouses. Eagle Bluff, Canna Island, the squat little light on Plum Island guarding the strait. I photographed monarchs lifting off the orchard rows in their thousands, heading south along the peninsula like the whole sky had decided to migrate at once. And every few days I photographed Bastian, secretly, the way you'd photograph something you weren't allowed to keep. His hands on a line, his back against the boathouse door, his face turned toward the lake. The way men turn toward things they've lost before and are afraid of losing again. I didn't know yet that the lake was about to test both of us at once. The town's biggest event of the year was 3 weeks out. Death's Door Maritime Heritage Days, a weekend of wooden boat races, a fish boil on the pier, and a parade of restored ships through the strait that drew tourists from 3 counties. Bastian's team ran water safety for the whole event, every year, without incident. He told me this the way he told me everything operational, flatly, like a man reciting a checklist to steady himself. "Every year it's fine," he said. "The strait's been killing boats since before Wisconsin was a state. 30-some wrecks down there. We just make sure this weekend isn't number 31. "You say that like a man trying to convince himself," I said. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. The morning of the parade was clear, the kind of high blue Door County sky that makes the cherry orchards look like something out of a postcard. I stood on the public dock with my camera and a press pass clipped to my jacket, shooting the wooden boats lining up at the harbor mouth. A sloop, a couple of restored Mackinaw fishing boats, a schooner replica with sails the color of old cream. Bastian's team was staged at the end of the pier, in their dry suits, the rescue boat idling, lines coiled and ready the way he always kept them. He didn't look at me. That was the agreement. His grandfather was there too, in a folding chair near the bait shop, a thermos of coffee in his lap, watching the boats with the particular pride of a man who'd spent his whole life on this water and had given his son and grandson to it in different ways. I did not see the squall line until it had already eaten the horizon. It came off, Lake Michigan, the way they always do up here, fast, with almost no warning beyond a sudden green-gray darkening to the north and a wind that dropped the temperature 10 degrees in 90 seconds. The harbor master's voice came over the PA, calm and urgent at once, telling the parade boats to make for shelter. Most did. The schooner Replica, top-heavy with its cream sails still half-rigged, didn't turn fast enough. I watched it go over from 400 yards away through my camera's long lens, the whole sequence unspooling in horrible, silent slow motion, the mast dipping, the deck tilting past the point where anyone could fix it, two figures going into water that the harbor's own warning signs describe as cold enough to take your breath in under 60 seconds, any month of the year. Bastian was already moving before the boat finished capsizing. I have never seen anyone move like that. Not frantic, not slow, just exactly as fast as the situation required, and not one motion wasted. He was in the water with a tether line before I'd lowered my camera. His team had the rescue boat moving behind him. I stood on the dock with my heart going somewhere it had never gone before, and I understood, finally, completely, what his careful arithmetic had always been protecting against. Not the town finding out about us. The exact shape of this fear. The rescue took 11 minutes. I know because I counted every one of them, standing on that dock with my camera hanging forgotten around my neck, watching Bastian disappear under the gray water near the overturned hull, and not come up, and not come up, and not come up. When he surfaced the first time, he had one of the sailors, a teenage deckhand, coughing and white with cold, and his team pulled the kid into the boat with the brisk, practiced economy of people who train for exactly this. Bastian went back down for the second sailor, the schooner's captain, who got entangled in rigging on the way under. The second time he surfaced, he came up alone and gasping, and his team had to haul him bodily over the gunwale because his legs had stopped answering him in the cold. The captain was still down there. He went back a third time. I do not remember deciding to run down the dock. I remember the wood under my feet and the wind and Peter Vandermeer's chair tipping over behind me as the old man stood up too fast. I remember the moment the rescue boat finally turned for the pier with all three bodies aboard, the rescued captain blue-lipped but breathing, and Bastian slumped against the gunwale with his dry suit torn at one shoulder and his face the color of the lake. He was shaking when they got him onto the dock. Not from the cold, or not only from the cold. I'd seen him brace for danger 100 times in 3 months, and I had never once seen him afraid until that moment, sitting on the planks with a silver emergency blanket around his shoulders, staring at his own hands like he was checking they still worked. I crouched in front of him before I remembered the rule. I forgot it on purpose. "You okay?" I said. His eyes found mine. Peter Vandermeer was 8 feet away. Half the town was on that dock, soaked and shouting and crying with relief, every one of them with a clear line of sight. "I keep being," Bastian said, and reached out and took my hand in both of his, in front of the harbor, in front of the rescue team, in front of his grandfather, and did not let go. For 1 full second, nothing happened. The wind, the water still dripping off the rescue boat's hull, the distant siren of the ambulance coming down the only road into Gill's Rock. Then Peter Vandermeer crossed the 8 feet between us, moving faster than I'd have guessed an 81-year-old man could move, and for one terrible breath. I thought I understood exactly what was about to happen, and I braced for it the way Bastian had spent 3 months bracing for it. The old man knelt down on the wet dock planks in front of his grandson, knees and all, heedless of his own age, heedless of everyone watching, and put both hands on Bastian's face and said something in low, fast French I didn't catch all of, except for one phrase, repeated twice. "Tu es vivant." "You're alive. You're alive?" Then he looked at me, really looked the way you look at someone you're finally seeing instead of someone you've decided in advance not to see. "You're the one who's been photographing my grandson's lighthouses," he said. His English was careful, formal, an immigrant's English even after 60 years on this peninsula. E.E.F. Verhoeven told me. She said you take his picture by the boathouse like a man in love. I didn't know what to say to that. Bastian, still shaking, still holding my hand on the dock in front of God and the volunteer fire department, found something to say for both of us. I am, he said. In love. With him. I should have told you in June. Pieter Vandermeer was quiet for a long moment, the water dripping off both of them, the ambulance pulling up at the head of the pier. You went down 3 times for strangers today, the old man said finally. You think I would let you hide from me the one thing that's been keeping you up? He shook his head, something between exasperation and grief moving through his weathered face. Your father never got old enough to be foolish about love, Bastian. I had hoped you would have the chance to be. They took Bastian to the clinic in Sister Bay for observation. Mild hypothermia, a dislocated shoulder he'd been ignoring for the better part of an hour, exhaustion that would put him flat for 2 days. I rode in the front of his grandfather's truck because Peter insisted, in that same formal English, that he wasn't going to let the man his grandson loved follow behind in a rental car like a stranger. We didn't talk much on the drive. There wasn't a version of small talk that fit what had just happened. Somewhere past the orchards, with the squall already breaking up into ordinary gray clouds heading east, Pieter spoke without looking away from the road. He has been afraid since his father went down, he said. Afraid of the water taking what he loves. I think that is also why he was afraid of you finding out you mattered that much. Easier to keep a secret small than to lose something large. I know, I said. You will be patient with him, the old man said. It wasn't quite a question. I have been, I said. I'll keep being. Pieter glanced at me then, and something in his face eased, just slightly, the particular release of a man setting down a fear he'd been carrying, without naming it as a fear. I found Bastian 3 hours later, released from the clinic with his arms strapped and a list of instructions he had no intention of following, sitting on the boathouse dock at dusk with the harbor finally calm again, the orchards behind us gone violet in the last light. The schooner's wreckage had been towed to the marina. The crowds had gone home with their own version of the day's story. A dramatic rescue, a captain saved, nothing more. I sat down beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched. Your grandfather likes me, I said. I think. I genuinely cannot tell if that was approval or shock. Both, Bastian said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water that had nearly taken him 3 times that afternoon. I've spent 6 years being the most careful man on this harbor. Every drill, every protocol, every line checked twice. And today I went under not knowing if I was coming back up. And the only thing I actually regretted was that I'd spent 3 months making you pretend not to know me on a dock. I never minded the dock, I said. I minded the rest of it, the not mattering part. You always mattered, he said. I was just bad arithmetic. I thought hiding you small meant I could keep you safe from this town's opinion of me. I didn't think about what it cost you to be hidden. He reached over with his good hand and found mine, the same hand he'd grabbed on the dock in front of everyone, and turned it palm up, and from his jacket pocket produced a short length of marine rope, frayed at one end from years of use. A rope he'd had on him, I realized, every single time he'd touched me since July. This was my father's, he said. The bowling he taught me on, I've had it in every pocket since I was 9 years old, like it could keep me steady. He looped it once loosely around my wrist, the way you check a knot for tension, and tied it off. Not tight, not a real restraint, just a circle of old rope holding the shape of something deliberate. I want to stop being the kind of careful that keeps people at the end of a tether. I want to be the kind of careful that holds on. That's a confession and a knot-tying lesson at the same time, I said, my voice not quite steady. I'm a man who shows love through rigging, he said. You knew that in July. I leaned my forehead against his, careful of the strapped shoulder, careful of all of it, and let the rope sit warm and rough against my pulse. I keep being, I said again, softer this time, not a question this time, just true. Me too, he said. Out loud now, for good. The town's volunteer fire department keeps a weather camera mounted on the harbor master's tower, The kind that streams a live feed to a marine forecasting site for boaters checking conditions before they head out into the strait. Nobody thinks about it. It's just infrastructure, a small gray box pointed at the water, updating its feed every 60 seconds for sailors 3 counties away. 3 days later, EEF Verhoeven from the bait shop sent Bastian a screenshot somebody had pulled from the public archive, timestamped to the exact minute the squall broke and the harbor went calm again. In the frame, blurry and wide and entirely unposed, you can just make out 2 men sitting on the end of the boathouse dock in the violet dusk, foreheads together, a strip of old rope visible at one wrist, an entire town's worth of orchards turning dark gold behind them. Nobody had been watching when it mattered. The lake had been watching the whole time. I didn't post that photo anywhere. I didn't need to. I have my own copy now, the good camera's copy, the one I took on purpose a week later from the same spot, in better light, on a calmer evening, with Bastian's grandfather 2 cherry trees away pretending not to watch us and failing completely. That's the one I keep. But I think about the harbor cams sometimes, the quiet, automatic, indifferent machine that caught the truth before either of us was ready to say it out loud, faithfully. The way the lake itself had been keeping our secret and our safety in the same cold hands all summer, waiting for us to stop being careful long enough to be seen. If a harbor camera caught something true about you once, I hope you understand why this one stayed with me. We're a small channel still working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and stories like this one only find new ears because people like you share them. Which moment got you? The third dive, the knot, or the grandfather on his knees on that dock? Tell us below. And if you haven't yet, subscribing helps more than you'd think.